My husband was standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone with one hand and stirring coffee with the other, when he said it. "Lauren's coming for Thanksgiving. She doesn't have anyone nearby, so don't make it uncomfortable." He didn't look up right away. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "And please don't do anything embarrassing." The spoon tapped once against the mug. The dishwasher hummed behind me. I was drying a serving bowl with a white dish towel, and I remember folding the towel over the rim very neatly before I said, "Of course." He went back to his screen like he had just mentioned the weather. What he did not know is that I had already mailed 2 invitations of my own. And by the time dessert reached the table, he was going to understand that silence and helplessness are not the same thing. 5 years earlier, I was 30 and living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Denver with original wood floors that creaked near the windows. I ran a small staging and interior styling business, mostly condos, a few boutique office spaces, one coffee shop I was still proud of. It was not a large operation, but it was mine. I chose the paint samples. I met the vendors. I stayed late when the install ran over. At night, I would come home smelling faintly of dust, cut flowers, and fresh lumber, and I slept well because the work was honest. That was where I met Eric. It was at a preservation fundraiser downtown, the kind of event with quiet jazz near the bar and too many people balancing wine glasses while talking about buildings they had never actually stepped inside. He worked in commercial development. He had the easy posture of a man used to being listened to. He asked careful questions. He remembered details. When I mentioned a project I was working on in Rhino, he brought it up again 2 weeks later as if it mattered. At the time, that felt rare. We got engaged after a little over a year. We married the next spring. I was 31 and so certain I was being chosen by someone steady and accomplished that I signed a prenuptial agreement without reading much beyond the opening page. His attorney called it routine. Eric called it practical. I told myself mature people handled things like that without turning them into drama. That was one of several mistakes I made by calling surrender maturity. The changes were gradual enough that, at first, I kept translating them into something kinder. He would glance at one of my client proposals and say, "You're talented, but this isn't exactly the level we're at now." Or he would ask whether I really needed to take on another small project when his schedule was getting more demanding. He started calling my business, "Your little design thing," always with a half smile that made objecting feel petty. Then one night, about a year and a half into the marriage, he sat across from me at dinner and explained that it made more sense for me to step back. The dining room light was low. I remember that. I remember the smell of rosemary chicken and the soft sound of sprinklers outside. He said, "I need a real partner at home, someone who can support the life we're building. Your income doesn't change anything for us financially." He said it calmly, not cruelly. That was part of what made it effective. By the end of that month, I had closed the business. I told clients I was taking time away. I boxed up my samples. I stopped answering old vendor threads. Then I moved fully into the life he preferred, in the house he had chosen in Cherry Hills Village, a large stone place with a bright kitchen and a backyard he loved because it had room for a putting green. I had wanted raised garden beds. We got the putting green. I learned the rhythms of his calendar. I hosted dinners for colleagues. I ordered flowers for the entry table. I made the house run smoothly enough that people began complimenting him on the life he had built. Lauren Pierce had been at Eric's firm for close to a year before I met her. At first, she was just a name that came up too often. Lauren found that off-market parcel. Lauren thinks the zoning issue can be handled quietly. Lauren's instincts are strong. It was never enough to confront, just enough to notice. When I finally met her at a company reception, she was polished in a careful, expensive way. Nothing loud. Cream silk blouse. Thin gold bracelet. The kind of person who holds eye contact half a second too long. She smiled at me warmly and asked whether I was still doing little design projects here and there. I said no. She tilted her head and said, "That must be such a relief." Eric's world seems demanding. At the time, I let it pass. I had grown skilled at letting things pass. The night everything changed was in October. I woke around 2 in the morning because I could hear wind moving against the bedroom windows. Eric was asleep beside me. His phone lit up on the nightstand. I had never touched it before. I still don't fully know why I picked it up that night. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was done translating things into kinder meanings. The screen was already awake, and a message preview sat there in the dark. Tonight was exactly what I needed. Miss you already. It was from Lauren. I sat at the edge of the bed and opened the thread. Then I read in silence while the house stayed completely still around me. Then I waited. I read for maybe half an hour, though it felt longer than that. The bedroom was dark except for the phone screen. Every few seconds, the heating system clicked softly in the walls, and Eric kept sleeping beside me like nothing in the room had changed. I sat very still and moved through the messages one screen at a time. It was not flirtation. It was not confusion. It was a full relationship, old enough to have routines, private language, repeated complaints. There were hotel confirmations, schedule adjustments, remarks about work trips that I now understood had not been work trips at all. There were messages about me, too. That was the part that landed hardest. He called me predictable. He said I had grown small. At one point he wrote, "She notices less than people think." Lauren's reply came a minute later. That's because she wants to believe the version that makes her comfortable. I remember staring at that line until the words blurred. Then I put the phone back exactly where I had found it. I lay down again without touching him and looked up at the ceiling until morning light started to show around the curtains. By breakfast, I was no longer confused. I was not calm yet, not exactly, but I was clear. And clarity has its own kind of quiet. The next morning, after Eric left for the office, I went into the study and unlocked the lower file cabinet with the key he kept in the top desk drawer. I had seen him use it many times. Inside were labeled folders, tax records, property documents, insurance papers, the kind of orderly system that makes a person feel protected just by looking at it. The prenuptial agreement was in a navy folder with our last name printed on the tab. This time I read every page. I sat at his desk with a legal pad beside me and went line by line. The house was silent except for the refrigerator motor starting and stopping in the kitchen. Around 11, sunlight moved across the rug and reached the leg of the chair. I kept reading. The agreement was built to protect him almost completely. If I filed for divorce before the end of year 6, I would receive a fixed settlement of $75,000. No claim to the house. No share in his investment accounts. No interest in future partnership distributions connected to his firm. 5 years of marriage reduced to a number he would barely notice missing. Then, deep in the back half of the document, I found a clause I am certain he had forgotten existed. It was simple language. In the event of documented marital infidelity by either spouse, the agreement would be unenforceable to the extent allowed under Colorado law, and marital assets would be subject to ordinary division proceedings. I read that section 3 times. Then I used the small scanner in the office to make a copy of the entire agreement and sent it to a new email account I created that afternoon from a coffee shop on Colorado Boulevard. I did not use our home Wi-Fi. I did not use my usual laptop. I bought a notebook and wrote down passwords by hand. That was the first day I stopped moving emotionally and started moving procedurally. A week later, I hired a private investigator. Her name was Elena Soto, former insurance fraud investigator, now private practice. I found her through a referral buried in an online forum where women discussed divorces in careful, unembellished language. No slogans, no speeches, just names, results, timelines. We met in a quiet bakery cafe in Lakewood on a rainy Tuesday morning. She arrived wearing a dark coat and carrying a slim laptop bag. She did not waste words. She asked what I had, what I suspected, and what outcome I needed. I told her I wanted proof that would survive scrutiny. Not rumors. Not screenshots taken in panic. Not something Eric could dismiss as a misunderstanding. I wanted dates, locations, records, photographs, and corroboration. Something a lawyer could put in a file without apology. She nodded once. "Then you stay exactly the same at home," she said. No new questions. No change in tone. No visible distance. People who think they're safe make mistakes. I said I could do that. And I could. For the next 2 weeks, I made dinner, answered texts, coordinated a dinner party for one of his investors, and listened when he talked about year-end planning. I asked the right follow-up questions. I stood beside him in the kitchen while he opened mail. I kept the house as orderly as ever. Meanwhile, Elena worked. Her first report arrived by encrypted email on a Friday afternoon while I was in the grocery store parking lot. It included photographs of Eric and Lauren entering a hotel near the tech center at 3:12 p.m. on a Wednesday. He had told me that day he was in a budgeting session until early evening. The second report came 4 days later. It had restaurant receipts, parking records, and 2 photographs of them leaving a condo building downtown that did not belong to either of them. The third report changed the shape of everything. Elena called instead of emailing. Her voice was level. "There's more," she said. "Lauren is also involved with Daniel Mercer." I knew the name immediately. Daniel was Eric's business partner. I sat down at the edge of the guest bed with the phone against my ear and looked at the folded quilt for a long moment before I said, "Tell me exactly what you mean." Elena did. Then I waited. Elena told me Lauren had been seeing Daniel for at least 7 months. Not socially. Not ambiguously. She had timestamps, garage footage, restaurant records, and a sequence of late-night entries into a side office Daniel kept at a mixed-use property their firm was developing near downtown. She also had something else, and this was the part that mattered beyond the marriages. Lauren had been receiving access she should not have had. Daniel had approved internal budget transfers connected to a new development group. He had copied her on financial threads outside her role. In one exchange, he pushed for her inclusion in an equity discussion that had not gone through the normal review channel. The language was careful, but the pattern was not. She was being moved closer to money and decision-making authority through him. I asked Elena to send me everything she legally could. She said she would organize it in stages. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen island with a yellow legal pad and began writing in a way I had not written in years. Not journaling. Not reacting. Structuring. I made 3 headings. Step 1, secure proof of infidelity. Step 2, confirm financial overlap and timeline. Step 3, identify who else had a right to know and whether they could help lock the facts down. Once I wrote it that way, the noise in my head settled. There was another wife in this, and I could not stop thinking about her. Daniel Mercer's wife was named Allison. I knew that much from firm events and charity dinners. She was a physical therapist. 2 children. Quiet, composed, usually the one keeping small things moving in the background while Daniel worked the room. I remembered once watching her kneel in a hallway outside a fundraiser ballroom, fixing her daughter's cardigan while answering a school email on her phone. Efficient. Tired. Self-contained. If what Elena had found was true, Allison had been lied to the same way I had. But contacting her too early could destroy the timing. If she confronted Daniel immediately, he could warn Eric. If Eric got even a hint that I knew, phones would be wiped, accounts would be moved, stories would be aligned. Everything would become harder. So I waited 3 days. In those 3 days, I watched Eric move through the house with complete confidence. He left shoes in the mudroom at angles that annoyed me. He asked whether I had sent the holiday cards. He stood beside me while I trimmed rosemary for a roast chicken and told me Lauren might join us for Thanksgiving because, in his words, it would be the kind thing. I remember the smell of garlic and olive oil in the kitchen, the low radio by the sink, the softness in his voice when he said her name. That was when I knew Thanksgiving would be the setting. A contained room, a fixed date, no need to chase anyone, no need to corner anyone privately and then listen to them rebuild the story later. If the truth entered the room all at once, in front of everyone who mattered, it would stay in its original form. But first I needed Allison. I asked Elena to find a safe way to reach her, something that would not point back to our home. Elena set up a secure email relay and told me to keep the first message short, factual, and free of emotional language. So I did. I wrote that I was the wife of her husband's business partner. I wrote that I had reason to believe both our marriages were being compromised by the same person. I wrote that I had attached 2 images, and that if she wanted to understand why I was contacting her, she only needed to look at the timestamps. I attached one photograph of Lauren entering Daniel's office building just after 10:40 p.m. I attached another of her leaving shortly before 1:30 in the morning. Then I sent it and put the phone face down. Her reply came the next day at 6:14 a.m. I was already awake. The house was dark and cold, and I was standing in the kitchen waiting for the kettle. Her message was only 2 lines. I've suspected something for months. Can we meet somewhere quiet? We met that Thursday at a park cafe in Greenwood Village, just after school drop-off and before lunch. It was one of those chilly Colorado mornings where the light looks sharp even through cloud cover. People were out walking dogs. Someone at the next table was eating oatmeal from a paper cup. The normalness of it made the conversation easier, I think. Allison recognized me immediately. She sat down, took off her gloves, and said, "Please don't soften it. I'd rather hear it clean." So I told her clean. I showed her the messages I had photographed from Eric's phone. Not all of them. Enough. I showed her the hotel records Elena had obtained. Then I showed her the material involving Daniel and Lauren. The times. The locations. The overlap. Allison did not interrupt. She kept one hand wrapped around her coffee cup and looked at everything with a still expression that reminded me of people in waiting rooms right before they receive test results. When she finished, she took a slow breath and said, "I have access to Daniel's home office." I did not answer right away. She looked at me and said, "He keeps paper copies of anything he thinks is important. He's old-fashioned that way. Contracts, printouts, side notes. If there's more, I can probably find it." I told her she did not have to decide anything on the spot. She gave one small, tired smile. "I'm deciding now," she said. "I have 2 kids. I'm not giving him extra time to prepare his version." That was the moment the balance shifted. Up to then, I had proof of betrayal. Painful proof, but still personal. What Allison offered meant this was no longer just about a marriage. It was also about approvals, access, signatures, and internal decisions inside a firm that cared deeply about liability and optics. Facts travel differently when they threaten money. Over the next 10 days, Allison and I communicated through the secure account Elena maintained for us. Allison worked carefully. She searched Daniel's office in pieces, never long enough to create a pattern. She photographed printed emails, copied transfer summaries, and found a folder related to a North Creek redevelopment parcel that included handwritten notes in Lauren's name despite her role not justifying any of that visibility. She also found something I had not expected, draft language positioning Lauren for a profit participation arrangement if the project closed under certain terms. It was not fully executed, but it was real enough to matter. Elena organized the evidence into categories: personal relationship timeline, hotel, dining, and parking records, photo surveillance, message extracts, firm-related irregularities, unauthorized access indicators. I printed hard copies at a shipping center across town and paid in cash. At home, nothing changed on the surface. Eric asked me one Sunday whether I had considered repainting the downstairs powder room before the holidays. He said the current color felt a little too dark. I stood there holding a dish towel and thought about how many rooms in that house carried decisions I had deferred because he liked something else better. Then I told him I would look at samples. That same night, once he was asleep, I sat in the guest room floor with all the materials spread around me in measured stacks. I used binder clips, sticky tabs, dates, sequence notes. I was not shaking anymore. I was building a record. Then, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, Eric looked up from his phone in the kitchen and told me Lauren would be joining us for dinner that year. I said, "That sounds fine." And in my mind, the plan became final. Once the date was fixed, everything became simpler. Not easier, just simpler. I stopped asking myself broad questions and started handling only the next necessary item. That helped. It turned fear into tasks and tasks I could manage. Step 1 was documentation control. I made 3 complete evidence sets. 1 stayed with Elena. 1 went to my attorney, a family law specialist in Denver named Marisol Green, who had reviewed the prenuptial agreement and confirmed that documented infidelity would significantly change the case posture. The 3rd stayed with me, but not in the house. I rented a small safe deposit box at a bank branch Eric never used and placed a flash drive, paper copies, and a handwritten timeline inside it. Step 2 was witness control. I did not want a spectacle. I wanted a clean record of what happened when the truth entered the room. For that, I needed one person I trusted completely, someone steady enough not to interrupt or escalate. I asked my friend Camille to come early on Thanksgiving Day. We had known each other since before I was married. She had seen the before and after clearly, even when I had not. I told her only what she needed to know. I said, something important is going to happen at dinner. I need you near me, and I need you to keep your phone charged. She was quiet for a moment, then said, do you want me there as a friend or as a witness? Both, I said. All right, she told me. Then I'll be both. Step 3 was timing. Allison agreed to bring Daniel at the end of dinner, not the beginning. That mattered. If they arrived too early, everyone would have time to reorganize themselves, to perform normalcy, to sense danger and become careful. I wanted the room settled first. Plates used. Wine poured. The false version of the evening fully in place. Only then would the doorbell ring. In the days leading up to Thanksgiving, I moved through the house with a kind of steady detachment that almost felt like recovery, except it wasn't recovery yet. It was precision. I ordered groceries. I polished serving pieces. I ironed the linen napkins I had bought years earlier and never used because Eric said they were too formal for the way people eat now. The weather turned colder that week. One morning there was frost along the backyard fence, and the flagstone patio looked silver under the early light. I stood at the sink with my hands around a mug of tea and watched my breath cloud the window while Eric stood behind me checking football schedules on his phone. He was in a good mood. That was the strange part. The closer we got to Thanksgiving, the more relaxed he seemed. He thanked me for being normal about Lauren coming. He told me he appreciated that I was not making things difficult. Once, while we were in the wine shop choosing a bottle to send home with her, he touched the small of my back and smiled at me in public, and I had to focus on the rows of labels in front of us to keep my face exactly still. The bottle he chose was an $85 Pinot from Oregon. He said it was elegant without trying too hard. I remember thinking that he liked that phrase because it described the kind of woman he always wanted in a room, one who made effort invisible. At home that night, I stood in the pantry with the door half closed and sent Allison the final dinner time. She replied with one line, "We'll arrive when you text." Elena's last update came 2 days before Thanksgiving. She had nothing dramatically new, which was good. It meant no one suspected anything. She also confirmed that the internal materials Allison had found were enough to create serious trouble for Daniel and Lauren if the firm's senior partners saw them. Not criminal, based on what we had, but certainly enough to trigger internal review, civil exposure, and an immediate end to Lauren's path upward. I printed that email and added it to the attorney set. The evening before Thanksgiving, I walked through the dining room alone and checked the table settings one place at a time. The chandelier was dimmed low. The silver reflected warm light in narrow lines. I adjusted the centerpiece by less than an inch and stood back again. Then I looked at the sideboard. Inside the top drawer were 2 folders and a sealed envelope. One folder contained the personal evidence. The other contained the firm-related material Allison had gathered. The envelope held divorce papers Marisol had prepared in advance, along with a short cover letter referencing the adultery clause and the preservation notice Eric was not to ignore. I slid the drawer shut. Then I waited. Thanksgiving morning, I woke before dawn. The house was cold and quiet, and the floors felt cool under my feet as I walked to the kitchen. I turned on only the small lights over the stove and island. The turkey had been dry brining in the refrigerator since Tuesday. I took it out, set it on the counter, and began. There is something clarifying about cooking when you know exactly what the day requires from you. Butter under the skin. Herbs chopped fine. Onion, celery stalk. Pie crust rolled and fitted into dishes. Trays in and out of the oven. I moved through it all without rushing. By 9, the kitchen smelled like sage, brown butter, and cinnamon. Eric came downstairs in a navy sweater, kissed my cheek, poured coffee, and said, "This already smells incredible." I thanked him. He looked around the kitchen, then toward the dining room, and smiled in that satisfied way he had when the house reflected well on him. "You always do the holidays well," he said. "I'm glad we're doing this." I said, "So am I." Camille arrived just after noon with a pecan pie and one long look at my face that told me she understood more than I had said over the phone. We hugged in the mudroom while cold air moved in around the door. "Do you need anything right now?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "Stay close later. And once it starts, don't interrupt." She nodded once. "Understood." Lauren arrived a little after 2. She came in wearing a camel coat and carrying the wine Eric had chosen. Her heels made a soft, even sound on the entry tile. She smiled at me warmly, complimented the house, and handed over the bottle as if she had every right to be there. I noticed details I might once have ignored: the pause before she hugged Eric, the way she watched his face to confirm the room still belonged to her version of the story, the casual confidence of someone used to moving through closed spaces with permission. I took her coat and hung it in the hall closet. She said, "Everything looks beautiful." "Thank you," I said. "Dinner's almost ready." For the next hour, I watched them from the edges of ordinary moments. From the sink while I rinsed a serving spoon. From the stove while I basted the turkey. From the dining room doorway while Camille asked Lauren a neutral question about downtown development. Eric leaned toward Lauren in conversation without realizing he was doing it. Lauren answered in the brisk, informed way that made him look pleased. It was subtle. It was enough. By the time we sat down to eat, I was no longer nervous. There is a point when a plan becomes real not because it has started, but because there is nothing left to add to it. The plates were warm. The candles were lit. Wind moved once against the back windows. Eric carved the turkey. Lauren complimented the stuffing. Camille stayed quiet, observant, with her phone resting face down beside her water glass. Dinner moved forward exactly as I had expected it would. And when dessert was almost ready, I stood from the table, carried the empty serving dish into the kitchen, and sent Allison a single word. "Now." Then I set my phone on the counter and listened for the doorbell. The bell rang less than a minute later. I dried my hands on a dish towel, set it beside the sink, and walked to the front door before Eric could reach it. I could feel him behind me, not close enough to stop me, but close enough that I was aware of him. When I opened the door, Allison was standing there in a dark wool coat with her hair pulled back, one hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag. Daniel stood beside her, shoulders tight, wearing the expression of a man who had agreed to something on incomplete information and was only now beginning to understand that. For a second, nobody moved. Then I smiled and said, "I'm glad you made it. Come in." Eric said my name behind me, quietly at first. "Megan." I stepped aside and let them enter. The entryway filled with cold air for a moment, then the door closed, and the house became very still. Lauren was just visible from the dining room, seated near the end of the table with her wine glass in her hand. The instant she saw Daniel, something changed in her face before she could control it. It was brief. A flash of recognition followed by calculation. But it was there. Daniel saw it too. Eric looked from Daniel to Allison, then to me. "What is this?" I kept my voice even. "A fuller table." No one laughed. Allison removed her coat and handed it to me with perfect calm. "Thank you for inviting us," she said. I thought it was time. That got Eric's attention in a different way. He was listening now, not speaking. We moved back into the dining room. Allison sat across from Lauren. Daniel took the chair beside her slowly, like every motion required an extra decision. Eric remained standing for a moment at the head of the table, then sat because there was no graceful alternative. Camille did exactly what I had asked. She stayed quiet. She reached for her water, and while doing that, she turned her phone so the camera faced outward from where it rested near her plate. I took my seat for one beat, long enough to let the room settle around the discomfort, and then I stood again. "Before I bring out dessert," I said, "there's something I need to address." Eric's voice came sharp this time. "Not now." I looked at him. Now is the only useful time. Then I walked to the sideboard and opened the top drawer. I took out the 2 folders and the sealed envelope. I set them on the table one by one with enough care that no one could mistake what they were. Paper has its own kind of authority when it arrives in a room without apology. Lauren placed her glass down. I think I should go. You can, I said. But first, I want the facts in the room exactly once, with everyone present. Eric stared at the folders. Megan, stop. I turned to him fully. For 5 years, I have stopped whenever you wanted comfort more than truth. I'm not doing that tonight. Then I opened the first folder. 7 weeks ago, I explained, I found messages between Eric and Lauren. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Lauren when I said it. I spoke the way I used to speak to clients when reviewing a project timeline that needed to be understood clearly the first time. I hired an investigator after that. I had the messages preserved, the locations verified, and the dates matched against the explanations I had been given. I slid several printed screenshots across the table toward Eric. He did not touch them. I turned the pages so the timestamps were visible. Hotel confirmations, garage entries, parking receipts, a photograph of Eric and Lauren exiting a hotel near downtown on an afternoon he told me he was in budget meetings. Another of them in a parking structure, his hand against the side of her face. Lauren drew in one quiet breath through her nose. This is invasive and unstable. It is documented, I said. Those are different things. Then I looked at Daniel. There is more, and this part concerns you. He had gone pale in a way that made his face look flat. Allison reached into her bag, removed her own set of copies, and laid them in front of him. Her voice was calm enough that, if someone had heard only the tone and not the words, they might have thought she was discussing school paperwork. Lauren has also been involved with Daniel, she said, for months, while asking him to approve financial access and project-related items outside ordinary process. She pushed forward printouts of emails, internal notes, and transfer authorizations. Daniel looked down, then back up at Lauren, then back down again. Eric finally picked up one sheet, scanned half a paragraph, and said, "What is this?" I answered before Allison could. "It's the North Creek redevelopment file, the one you've been excited about for weeks." Daniel approved side allocations and access positioning that benefited Lauren. She was being moved toward a financial stake without the normal review. Allison found the records in his office. Elena verified the sequence. Lauren stood up too quickly, her chair scraping hard against the floor. "This is absurd. You invited people into your house to perform some kind of trial." "No," I said. "I invited witnesses so nobody could edit the story afterward." That was when Eric looked at Lauren properly. Not like a man defending someone. Like a man adding figures and realizing the totals no longer worked. "Is this true?" he asked her. She didn't answer him. She looked at me instead. "You've blown up 2 families because you couldn't manage your emotions." I held her gaze. "No, I managed them very carefully." The room stayed silent. Then Allison said, in the same level voice, "I've already copied everything. If either of you plans to deny the financial side, that option is gone." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers, not speaking. Eric was still staring at the documents like they might rearrange themselves if he gave them enough time. I placed the sealed envelope in front of him. "That is from my attorney," I said. Inside are divorce papers and notice regarding the infidelity clause in the prenuptial agreement. I'm not leaving with a fixed settlement and a suitcase. We'll divide the marriage under ordinary law. For the first time all evening, Eric looked directly shaken. He said my name once, quietly. "Megan." I did not sit down. I did not repeat myself. I let the paper do the work. Then I waited. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator motor turn on in the kitchen and the faint rattle of the vent above the stove. A candle near the center of the table gave off one soft pop, then steadied again. It is strange what you notice when a room stops pretending. Eric kept one hand on the envelope, but still did not open it. Lauren was standing now, one palm flat against the table, her coat still in the front closet, her face no longer warm or polished or composed. Not undone exactly, more like stripped down to the part underneath the performance. Daniel was the first one to sit back. He looked at the papers in front of him, then at Allison, then at me. How much of this has been shared outside this room? I answered him plainly. My attorney has a full set. Elena retained her file. Allison copied the internal material. And at 3 this afternoon, a summary packet went to 2 senior partners at the firm with enough documentation to preserve the records before anyone could clean them up. That landed hard. Daniel looked at Allison. You sent it. She folded her hands in her lap. Yes. He looked down again. Not angry. Not even defensive, at least not first. He looked like a man realizing that his private choices had already been translated into process, and that process was now moving without him. Eric finally opened the envelope. He read the first page, then the second. His mouth tightened. He turned to the clause summary Marisol had attached and read that too. I watched him reach the line about documented adultery and the likely effect on enforcement of the agreement, and I could see the exact moment he understood that what he had once treated as a technicality was now the center of the rune. This doesn't mean you get everything, he said. No, I said. It means you don't get to decide the outcome alone. He looked up at me then, really looked, with something I had not seen from him in a long time. Not love. Not respect yet, either. Recognition, maybe. The recognition that comes too late, after a person realizes the version of someone they relied on was never the whole picture. Lauren reached for her bag. Eric noticed. Wait. She turned to him slowly. His voice had changed. It was flatter now, less personal. Did you ask Daniel to move money into the North Creek subaccount? She said nothing. Did you? He asked again. Lauren gave a small, disbelieving shake of her head, as if she could not quite accept the turn the room had taken. You cannot seriously be doing this right now. I'm doing exactly this right now, he said. It was the first honest thing I had heard him say all evening. She looked at Daniel next, maybe expecting him to intervene, to soften it, to redirect the blame back into the kind of ambiguity she had been operating inside. But Daniel did not help her. Allison reached into her folder and slid one final sheet across the table. It was an email printout with Daniel's approval language, Lauren's reply, and the project code along the top. I highlighted the relevant line, Allison said. Lauren didn't touch it. Eric did. He read it. Then he read it again. This is enough for an internal audit, he said quietly, almost to himself. Yes, I replied. That was when the consequences stopped being emotional and became structural. There would be firm counsel, review of authorizations, questions about access, approvals, governance, exposure. Even if nothing criminal came of it, careers could narrow very quickly under that kind of light. Invitations disappeared. Titles stalled. Equity conversations ended. People who once seemed untouchable became administrative problems. The room knew that. Lauren picked up her bag. I'm leaving. You should, Allison said. There was no anger in the words. That made them harder. Lauren looked at me one last time before she went. Not pleading. Not apologetic. Measuring, maybe. Trying to understand how I had crossed from the role she had assigned me into the one standing in front of her now. Then she walked out. A minute later, the front door closed. No one moved right away. Daniel sat with both hands flat on the table, staring at the papers in front of him. Allison looked past him toward the dining room window, where the glass reflected the candles and the darkening yard outside. Eric folded the first page of the divorce packet once, then flattened it again. Camille remained exactly where she was, quiet and steady. Finally, Daniel said, Allison. She turned her head just enough to show she had heard him. He swallowed, then stopped. Whatever sentence he had planned did not survive contact with the evidence. He stood, gathered none of the papers, and said only, I'll call tomorrow. Allison said, no. You'll email. It was such a small correction, but it changed the air again. A boundary stated in ordinary language. No room for improvisation. Daniel nodded once. Then he left. After that, Eric and I were the only married couple still sitting at the table, though by then the marriage felt more like a matter of filing status than reality. He looked tired in a way I had not seen before. Not wounded pride exactly. More like exhaustion from holding multiple versions of himself together and watching them separate all at once. I was going to tell you, he said. I did not answer immediately because I wanted the truth of the moment, not the convenience of the script. "No," I said at last. "You are going to continue until it cost you something." He looked down. I stood and began gathering plates. Camille rose with me without a word and carried the serving dishes into the kitchen. Allison joined us a few seconds later, taking the water glasses. None of us spoke until we were under the warmer light above the counters, away from the table. Then Allison set down the glasses and said quietly, "Thank you for not warning me gently." I looked at her. She gave one small nod. Clean was better. "Yes," I said. I thought so too. We stood there for a moment with the smell of coffee and pie and roasted turkey still in the room, the ordinary remains of a holiday that had split open exactly as planned. In the dining room, I could hear Eric unfold the papers again. That night he packed one bag. He took shirts, a coat, his laptop, and the leather toiletry case his sister had given him one Christmas. He moved through the bedroom quietly, as if volume might still matter. I sat in the reading chair by the window and watched without helping. At the door he stopped and said, "I am sorry." I believed he meant it. I also knew it had arrived too late to be useful. When the door closed behind him, the house did not feel triumphant. It felt still, honest, larger somehow. And for the first time in years, nothing in it was waiting to be explained away. After Eric left, the house got quiet in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. Not empty, just quiet. Camille stayed long enough to help me clear the table. We wrapped leftovers in foil, stacked plates beside the sink, and put half the pie back in the refrigerator. The dishwasher ran. A pan soaked in warm water. Someone on a neighboring property had string lights along a fence, and through the back window I could see them reflecting faintly against the glass. Neither of us talked much. At one point, Camille handed me a dish towel and said, "You were very steady." I folded the towel once before I answered. I had to be. She nodded like that made complete sense, because it did. When she finally left, I locked the front door, turned off the dining room lights, and stood for a minute in the kitchen with my hands resting on the back of a chair. The turkey platter was clean. The candles had burned low. There were still 2 wine glasses on the counter waiting to be washed. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. Clear, but tired. That night I made tea I did not really want and sat at the kitchen island in socks and an old gray sweater while the kettle clicked as it cooled. I looked over the attorney notes once more, then closed the folder and put it away. There was nothing left to solve that evening. For the first time in a long time, the work in front of me belonged to professionals, timelines, signatures, and rules. I no longer had to carry it in my body. The divorce took just under 5 months. Eric did not fight much once the evidence was fully organized and exchanged. Marisol handled everything exactly the way she said she would. Dates, disclosures, property valuation, account tracing, the house, retirement assets. The terms changed because the facts changed, and once that happened, the rest moved the way these things move when paperwork is stronger than denial. Daniel resigned from the firm before the internal review finished. I heard that through Allison, who texted me once in January to say only, "It's moving." A few weeks later she filed. She kept the house their children had grown up in. We never became close in the sentimental way people expect after something like that, but we stayed connected in a practical, respectful way. Sometimes that is the more honest version of support. Lauren was gone from the firm before the new year. I did not ask for details. I had spent enough time inside that story already. What mattered to me was what happened after the noise stopped. The house was mine to arrange at last. The first room I changed was the living room. I repainted it in a deep clay color I had wanted for years, something warmer than beige, something that looked alive in afternoon light. I replaced the stiff furniture Eric preferred with pieces that were easier to actually sit in. I took measurements for built-in shelving. I pulled up old design files and started sketching again at the dining table with pencils I had not touched in far too long. In the spring, I called 3 former clients. 2 had already moved on. 1 had not. She owned a small hospitality group and needed help updating a boutique property outside Boulder. We met for coffee. I brought material samples, a notebook, and a floor plan rolled into a tube that barely fit in my truck. She looked at the samples, then at me, and said, "I was always hoping you'd come back to work." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. I took the project. Then another came in through referral. Then a small restaurant renovation. Then a lobby redesign for a medical office that paid less than it should have, but gave me momentum. The work returned the way strength returns after a long illness. Not all at once. Quietly. Then steadily. Some mornings I would leave the house early with coffee in a travel mug and a paint-stained folder on the passenger seat and realize I had gone 40 minutes without thinking about Eric at all. The first time that happened, I noticed it at a red light and almost laughed. That was how I knew I was really leaving. By summer, I had a vegetable bed where the pudding green used to be. Tomatoes. Basil. 2 kinds of peppers. The first afternoon I dug into that corner of the yard, the soil smelled warm and mineral-rich, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I had once needed permission in my own life for something as ordinary as a garden. I didn't need permission anymore. A few months later, a woman from an online support forum sent me a message after reading a short version of what had happened. She was in Oregon, married 8 years. Said her husband controlled everything so gradually she had almost mistaken it for care. She wrote that she was not sure she was ready to leave, but she had started making a list. I wrote back and told her to keep going. Nothing dramatic. Just the next real thing. Documents. Passwords. Copies. People she could trust. I told her silence can be useful if you are using it to prepare and dangerous if you are using it to disappear. She understood the difference immediately. Since then, I have spoken with a few other women in similar situations. Not as an expert. Not as a therapist. Just as someone who knows what it feels like when another person mistakes your calm for incapacity. They are not the same thing. Sometimes, early in the morning, I still think about that Thanksgiving table. Not with anger anymore. Mostly with distance. I remember the sound of the front door closing after Lauren left. I remember the weight of the folder in my hands. I remember that the room did not change because I became louder. It changed because I became precise. That mattered more. Now my days are ordinary in ways I value deeply. I go to job sites. I answer client emails. I water the garden before the heat comes up. I repaint rooms when I feel like it. I eat dinner at the kitchen counter if I do not feel like setting the table. Some nights the house is messy with fabric books and tile samples and takeout containers, and I look around and feel a kind of peace I did not used to trust. It is mine because I built it again carefully. And that is enough. If you stayed with me through this, thank you. I'm glad you were here. Please like and subscribe if this kind of calm, honest story is the kind of thing you want more of. And in the comments, tell me which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I always like seeing where people are listening from. 2 popular stories will be waiting for you next, and I think both of them are worth your time.